very much like extreme titles, like titles that are so short as to be monosyllables. And then I also like really sprawling titles. Um, and the memoir that I published prior to Creep was titled Mean. And again, we've got this monosyllabic, kind of punchy word that functions as both noun and verb. And because Creep is both prequel and sequel in some regards to Mean, I wanted to indicate that through the title itself. And the word creep appears throughout the various essays. So the reader creeps through the book until arriving at the title essay.
Yeah, I mean, it's like made me think. Like, what is it? We use this word in the vernacular. It's like a casual thing. Like, oh, what a creep.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to think to myself, like, well, what is a creep? Creep's like a bad person. I mean,
Yeah.
these are the ways I characterize it to myself. But
Yeah.
it's also somebody who gives me weird feelings, like he's creeping
Exactly.
me out. And then
Mm-hmm.
creeping is also used at turns in this collection as a verb. I note
Absolutely.
I noticed it. So it's got like a kind of manifold meaning.
Yes. Yeah. And the title is an invitation to the reader to think with me and to meditate with me on that word and the popularity of that word and how that word is capable of holding multitudes.
Yeah. Well, and it also made me think of that Radiohead song where it's almost used as
Absolutely.
it's like derogatory, like where you're self-denigrating,
Exactly.
you're thinking of yourself as a creep, which if I'm being honest, I've had my moments where I'm like, ugh, I'm such a creep, or my daughter will be like, Dad, that's creepy.
Yeah. Well,
Like we all take turns sort of, we all like, it's one thing to have creeps in our lives, but I think we also all take turns being a creep or feeling like one.
absolutely. And again, like the book is an invitation to consider the creeps who have insinuated themselves into our lives, but to also consider how we're implicated in what we might want to call creepdom, because we all are in some sense. And so it's an invitation to the reader to meditate on that and to locate oneself within creepdom.
Yeah, creepdom. I like this. And this book, the subtitle of this book is Accusations and Confessions, which is, I think, what you're speaking to there. This is not just you looking outward and kind of telling about the creeps in your life. It's also you kind of self-investigating and maybe exploring aspects of yourself that might qualify in the creepdom, what do you call it, spectrum or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the book's project is a reassessment of figures who've been very influential in a literary sense, and who have been cultural movers and shakers, and have achieved almost idol status. And so I'm inviting people to rethink those figures as creeps, and then also inviting people to consider what their legacy might be, because all of our legacies are going to be mixed. We're humans, right? And so we're all going to leave these mixed legacies. And I think that when we focus on our mortality and we think of ourselves as being future ancestors, we can think much more critically about the way that we live now, and living rightly and justly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like some of the people that you are painting in this collection and kind of drawing into creepdom and making the reader re-examine in many cases. William Burroughs, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who that was a part of Mexican political history that I was not aware of. I didn't know that story about him, but he was the president of Mexico who at the age of 4 shot his family's cleaning lady, right?
He shot one of the family's domestic workers, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, like, My God. And by the way, did I
The
just use,
youngest domestic worker at the home in the
oh,
context of a war game. That essay is about death games and the death games that we all play, inadvertently and at times intentionally, and what we do sort of in preparation for death, right? And those types of games are fun until somebody actually gets killed, you know?
right.
So
Which doesn't happen often, thank God.
about that essay where we have people in particular, people who are gendered as men, who are engaging in what they claim to be acts of play, but the stakes are quite high, and in those supposed acts of play, women are repeatedly losing their lives.
Yeah. I mean, I remember as a kid, my buddies and I, we played a game called Guns. We were just like, you want to play Guns? Just like 5 years old, like, want to play
Yeah,
Guns? Yeah, let's play Guns. And we just pretend to shoot
yeah.
each other or be like Star Wars characters or whatever. And then there's a death game that you describe that involved you and I believe your cousin. Is that right? Where you were, or I'm trying to think, was it a neighbor? I forget the exact details, but you were throwing Barbie dolls like off of, a balcony basically to
Yeah,
their,
that's the way most kids play with Barbie dolls.
they
Like,
torture them.
like most kids play violent games with dolls. Like uh and there was an explosion of this sort of storytelling about sort of violent doll games when the Barbie movie was released, right? Twitter was awash in these horrific stories that were also kind of delightful about girls, asserting kind of violent autonomy in terms of how they would play games with Barbies, which seemed to me to be sort of the equivalent of these other violent games that are typically associated with children with more masculine genders, like quote unquote cowboys and Indians. You have girls playing similar games. Like when girls play house, it's not necessarily that they're baking cookies and tucking people into bed. Sometimes they're poisoning people and throwing people out windows. That's another way of playing house. You know what I mean?
These are your options, right? You've got a lot of options as a young
Exactly.
child.
Consider what it is that goes on in people's houses. Uh,
Well,
that's the staging ground for domestic violence. And when children play games, they're mimicking what they see adults do. So
well,
so
there's an interesting,
that's what I was doing as a child.
yeah, and what you just said calls to mind a passage in the book, and I'm going to forget exactly where it lives. I think it was either a passage in the book or it was something that you said in an interview that I read when I was preparing. So it's all jumbled together in my mind. But you were saying something to the effect of like, go outside wherever you live, look around at the houses on your street or the apartment buildings on your street, whatever it is. There are dramas unfolding behind those doors. There are bad things happening,
Yeah,
essentially, in some of these houses anyway. And people you would never know because so
exactly.
much of this stuff lives in the dark.
In privacy. Yes, it lives in privacy. It thrives in privacy. It thrives in secrecy. It thrives in the domestic sphere, right? And that domestic sphere is often the realm of a particular tyrant or a group of tyrants who don't appear to be tyrants in their public facing personae, right? And so I wrote that with this in mind when I did escape from domestic violence, and I began to disclose to people that I trusted that had happened. I was met with sort of this deluge of disclosures that happened in so many different places, and that sort of cascade of disclosures was incredibly eye-opening for me. And then I came to realize that as I had been experiencing domestic violence, I was surrounded by people who were also experiencing the same ordeal and the same predicament, but they were doing it quietly and with a smile on their face, just as I had been doing. I recall, for example, going to visit a family member who was living in a skilled nursing facility. I had been unable to see him because I had been in hiding. I had gone into hiding after I had escaped from domestic violence, and so I had finally been able to leave my hiding place and go visit this family member. And I disclosed to one of the workers at the nursing facility the reason why I had not come to visit my loved one. And in response, she removed her teeth. She removed her upper teeth. They were dentures, and she said, "My husband did this, so I know what you're talking about." I can relate. Because
My
I showed
God.
her, and then I showed her my broken teeth, because I have a broken tooth from what happened to me. So there were connections like that, extremely visceral connections that I was making with people once I decided to disclose, and I found them everywhere.
Did it surprise you?
Um, in the beginning, it did, and then it stopped surprising me, and then I became very sort of accepting of the ubiquity of the problem.
Of
And
people.
then it came. Now I'm at a point where I'm much better at detecting signs that a person is experiencing that, or that a person might be perpetrating that kind of harm. And so I am sometimes now less surprised when I hear a disclosure, because I can see some signs. There are sometimes some hints and some clues present. But before I escaped from domestic violence, I likely would have been unable to pick up on those.
What are some signs? I'm curious.
For example, if a person seems very isolated and has to check in with a partner, and essentially ask for permission to have a social life, you are potentially interacting with a person who's surviving domestic violence. Most of us don't have to seek so much permission in order to have a free social life or a free intellectual life. So that would be an example.
Well, there are, as I mentioned, figures in the culture who you are pointing to as creeps, or as like creep adjacent. Or
Yeah.
I mentioned William Burroughs, who, some people might not know who are listening, shot his wife, Joan Vollmer, in, it was an accident, but it was
He
still.
claims it was an accident. I think
Yeah.
it's very important when we talk about abusive men, especially men who've committed femicide, to contextualize what they call accidents as accidents that they are identifying as accidents, but that perhaps might not be accidents.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the only thing I would say is, like, there was a third party there. I mean, who knows? That guy might have been an abuser too. But there was like people in the room, and he was
Yeah,
trying
one
to.
of them was Burroughs' lover. One of them
Oh,
was his male lover. And men often commit acts of violence to impress other men, which is what makes me doubt the accidental nature. Also, women don't get murdered for staying with an abusive partner. They get murdered for leaving their abusive partner. Vollmer had indicated several weeks prior to being shot that she wanted a divorce.
and then he was trying to shoot something off the top of her head.
According to lore, he wanted to show off his marksmanship because he was selling some guns. And so he invited Joan to place a glass on her head. And she did. And then he took aim and he fired. And he hit her in the head.
Wow.
He struck her in the head, and she died.
Okay. So others whom you write about: Richard Ramirez, otherwise known as the Night Stalker, like a
Yeah.
famous, infamous serial killer in Southern
Yeah.
California. Terrifying guy. Like, there's a documentary that was on Netflix. I don't know if you're familiar with this,
I
but
watched it. Yeah.
you did? Okay. I like looked at it, but I'm too much of a chicken. I can't watch that sort of stuff before going to bed. But I'm just like, man,
It's not worth
terrifying.
it. It's not worth your time.
Okay.
It's
Well,
tacky
thanks.
and voyeuristic.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Done. So then there is, in addition to Richard Ramirez, there's Tommy Jesse Martinez, who attacked you. And
Yes, he's a man
is
who
your
sexually assaulted me and who has been identified as having assaulted about 5 other women, and he murdered one of the women he assaulted.
okay, and that is something that you write about in your preceding book, the memoir
Yes.
Mean, which generated a lot of attention.
Yes. Yes.
And then Joan Didion gets, kind of mixed treatment. I think she's been a literary influence on you in positive ways, but in her work and in her life, perhaps, was insensitive in your view to Mexican culture and Mexican people. Like, her family history has a lot to do with the founding of California, or I'm going to mischaracterize this.
Yeah.
She had, like, ancestors who kind of came over on the wagon train to settle California and steal the land essentially from people.
She's very proud of her pioneer ancestry. And I was raised by my parents, by my father in particular, to scoff at the word pioneer. My father would always joke that if there are people there to greet you, then you're not a pioneer.
Right.
So there were plenty of folks to greet these assholes when they arrived in California. So they were not pioneers, although that's what they dubbed themselves. But yeah, Didion is present because the collection is in many ways a family history, and it's also a literary genealogy of sorts. And we don't really have much of a choice in who our influences are. Our influences find us. We don't necessarily find them. And so Didion is one of those people whose writing found its way to me. And when I first found her writing, I was so enthusiastic about it because here was a woman writing about a place that I knew very intimately, and a place that I loved, the place where I was born, the place where I hope to die and be buried, you know? And then as I matured, and I became more familiar with her work, its racist politics began to trouble me. And so I attempt to reckon with those politics and the influence that she had on me. And I attempt to familiarize my reader with a California that is inaccessible through Didion. And so I offer a different vision of California. And ultimately what I'm arguing is that Didion's vision of California is very limited, and yet it's her vision that dominates.
Right. I was going to say, this is, I mean, this is in addition to being about creepdom.
Exactly.
This is very much to me a California book, and you're very, you're so open about the fact that you love California. You're a California person, born and raised, want to die. You're I want to die and be buried in the soil. Yeah.
As a kid, I had those thoughts. I'm a weirdo when it comes to loyalty to place. If I love a place, I love it in the same way that I would love a person. I even want to hold on to the place. I want to cuddle with the place. I remember, as a kid, finding California to, thinking that California had such a delicious smell that I wanted to put California in my mouth and eat it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because of the smell of the sage and the wet earth, and So in some ways, a lot of the work that I do is like a perpetual love letter to California.
Yeah. Well, and I think I should say, I'm not a native Californian, but I've lived here for 22, 23 years. I love it too. It's such a magical place. I think, in my view, it contains so much. You've written and spoken about this really beautifully and said a lot of the things that I feel it's cultural diversity, it's geographical diversity. It's got everything. There's so much going on here, and it's just so staggeringly beautiful. So I share your love for California, and I think that as a writer who is wanting to write about California and to imbue her work with this sense of place and this love of place, pretty impossible for somebody writing in these times anyway to write about California without contending with Joan Didion, because as you said, she's sort of the person, the writer who is most commonly, I think, associated with this place, or one of them anyway, as a person who has written about this place and brought it to life in literature in a way that is really affecting and pervasive in the culture.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But limited.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And and when I do give Didion her flowers, one of the things that I write is that she mentored me in sort of this coolness and this condescension. There's a certain stance that she pioneered and excelled at, and so she is in part responsible for my voice. She mentored my voice in a sense, and so I am grateful to her for that. But she deserves a scolding for for a lot of her politics.
Well, I did an episode years ago with some writers. It was multiple guests who had, I think, written for and edited an anthology of work about Joan Didion in California. It wasn't like by her, but it was about her, and it was about California. One of the things that has bothered me, because I find, listen, I love those essays for many of the same reasons that you do. She's a beautiful writer, obviously a very smart human being with like a very sharp mind, very gifted. So, like she deserves her flowers, as you said. But like one of the things about Joan Didion that has always given me pause has to do with the way in which she is often valorized by writers, younger writers, and on social media. It's less for the writing and it's more for the lifestyle.
Of course.
It's like, oh, the Corvette and the big sunglasses and the cigarette and the Malibu house.
A template for a certain type of like cool bitch glamour. You know what I mean?
Right.
That I think there are a lot of girls in their or women in their 20s and 30s aspire to. Like we want that romance and we want to project that glamour too. And so I'm seduced by it too. Like she, you know what I mean? You've got this writer with these big shades and her long cigarette and her hair blowing and she's in the bright yellow Corvette. I mean, come on. Like
I get it. It's aesthetically
to be seduced by that kind of imagery.
No, yeah. I get it as like at the purely aesthetic level.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's a little bit annoying to me when she's like, I was tired, so, we went off to Hawaii.
It's totally annoying.
She's constantly just like, we went to the Beverly Hills Hotel because I was exhausted. And it's like, okay, well,
but it's
nice.
also so aspirationally American. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that there are so many people who like, yes, like I want that. Like, I want to have a terrible day that ends in me on a fainting couch in the Beverly Hills Hotel. Do you know what I mean? Like, what a life.
What a life. What a life. But, it's like, what was it? Why am I blanking on her husband's name?
Dunn. Gregory Dunn.
Gregory Dunn. Yeah, Gregory Dunn. I mean, he came from a ton of money, didn't he? So like they just kind of, So they were
exactly
just
like
living
I
large.
I like one of the anecdotes about them that cracks me up is that they were so bored at the San Ysidro Ranch during their honeymoon, which is like where the Kennedys honeymooned. It was just so dull that they had to decamp and go to Beverly Hills or San Francisco or wherever it was that they went. I mean, it's just. What wonderful things to complain about. You know what I mean?
I was going to say.
To have those complaints.
Yeah, high class problems. So
exactly.
So you write about her, and again, it's mixed. It's not like just like a hate fest. Like you do have some love for Joan. We got to say that. And then the book ends powerfully. Another person that you write about is an ex-boyfriend, domestic abuser that you refer to as Q.
Yes.
So there's that. Oh, and then I missed your cousin Desiree, also very affecting writing, very like moving to read about Desiree and her trajectory in life and, the things that she has suffered through and had to deal with and the long road that she has had to travel. So, there are lots of different interesting figures. Some are cultural and public figures and some are, more from your personal life, but they all fall somewhere under the umbrella of creepdom somehow.
Yes.
And I think, what's interesting to me as I was reading this, I find this is often the case in really good essay writing, is the associations that you are drawing. And a question that I have for you is how it happens, because there's a lot of energy and magic in essays where an author is kind of telling you one story and then like veering off onto another trajectory, which these essays do. They move. There's a lot of velocity on the page, and it's fun. It's fun because it keeps you going, and you never quite know what's going to happen, and then boom, you'll draw a line between two or three different things that had felt disparate. But then you realize, for example, that, oh God, I'm going to screw this up, but I want to say two of the Night Stalker's victims are buried in the same cemetery that your grandmother is buried in. So it's like a question that I have. A question I have for you is, did you begin these essays with those associations in mind, or did those associations come to you, or were they realized in the writing itself?
Both. So it happened both ways. So, Not always, but often essays are provoked by a feelings of discomfort or annoyance with arguments that I hear repeated that don't make much sense to me. And so that tends to provoke like some sort of investigation that then leads to the drafting of an essay. And I kind of think of essays as my version of algebra, where I'm solving for y and I'm doing it through language. Um, uh, uh, and and so, for example, there's an essay called Slimed, where I explore the intersection of humor and horror. And I write about rape in the context of practical jokes. And the spark for that essay, there were actually two sparks for that essay. One of the sparks was that when Mean was published, some of the criticism that I received for that book was aimed at my style, that I used a comedic style to narrate an account of sexual violence. And there were some readers and some critics who found that to be inappropriate, that I needed to use, that it would have been more appropriate for me to have used a serious tone or even like a reverential tone. And I've always thought that like rape is a lot more offensive than jokes about rape. And I think that sort of that evaluation is lost when people want to purge comedy from certain kinds of storytelling. And so that kind of spurred the writing of that essay. And then another spark was this knee-jerk reaction that I've noticed that some people have to misogynist humor. For example, a man might crack a misogynist joke, and the knee-jerk reaction is, well, I didn't find what he just articulated funny, therefore it's not a joke. And so we're going to recategorize the statement that he made as something other than a joke. And I don't understand why we need to recategorize what the man has said as something other than a joke because somebody didn't find it funny. Most of us, I think, I mean, I don't find most jokes that people make funny, but I can still recognize that they're jokes because jokes, I think, jokes have a social function. They don't necessarily function for the sake of amusement. And so my discomfort with both of those phenomena was what then led me to sit down and start thinking through it. And so these ideas seem very disparate, but my job is to consider the intersection and the crossroads.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're juxtaposing a lot in this collection. And it's part of the fun of it, you know, is that you're drawing lines between things that people don't normally draw lines between. And you're finding, like convincingly, I think, oftentimes, finding things in common. I mean, one of the things you talked about just a second ago is this similarity between like practical jokes and sexual assault. And it's this idea that horror and comedy are both a violation. And that they both involve the breaking of rules. And that's very true, right? I mean, so they do share that in common. And it's
typically a subversion or inversion of power.
Yeah.
Right? Because the practical joke is played on somebody. And rape functions similarly. Sexual assault functions similarly. And the shared element is lack of consent and the element of surprise.
Right. I mean, I've said this on this show many times, but I'll say it again. I feel like maybe most permissive in my life. I don't know. I feel very permissive when it comes to humor if somebody is joking in good faith, even if I don't find it funny. Like if somebody's telling a joke and they mean to be silly, even if it's like irreverent or impolitic, as long as they're not being like outright mean to somebody and they're punching down at somebody, I don't I'm willing to allow a joke, and I don't get it when people get super intense about it and want to police humor.
Well, I think that, policing humor aside, I think it's very important for us to take the humor of supremacists seriously, because those supremacists are communicating their values to us. And they're also offering to us their vision of the world and their vision of an idealized world. And so, in a sense, they're giving us their playbook. And why would we reject that playbook? Why would you reject the receipt of your enemy's playbook when they're offering it to you? And maybe you didn't expect to receive that playbook through a list of jokes. But if that's how it comes to you, use it. Don't reject it because it's lowbrow.
Right, right. And, I think for somebody who's suffered sexual assault, or somebody who's suffering from like really intense depression, like I've seen this same sort of thing, the same sort of dynamic play out with people where it's like, you shouldn't be joking about suicidal ideation and depression. And it's like, well, if the person who is suffering from deep depression decides to try to process it through humor,
Exactly.
or the person who has suffered sexual assault decides to process it through humor, like, who are we to say don't do that? Like,
Exactly.
So I think it's very interesting and very human. It's also, I think, a very effective way to alchemize some of this tougher stuff in life. Like,
Truly.
what else are we supposed to do with it? Like, if you can't try to find some humor in the darkness, like,
Yeah.
you're dealing with it.
I was kidding the other day with somebody and saying that I'm the Mary Poppins of sexual assault because because when I do discuss this subject, I acknowledge that we need our spoonful of sugar, right? And that comes in the form of comedy in my case,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
yes, so here I am, Mary Poppins.
Well, there is a great irreverence in your work, and there's a lot of humor and kind of like blunt. It's like this very blunt humor that is in every essay. And I love that, because this essay is dealing with darkness, but to have, you can write a book or make art that is entirely in the dark, right? It's all about the darkness and it focuses there, and there's not a laugh in it, and it can be beautifully done. So there are no rules. But what I will often say is that I really appreciate work that embodies kind of all of it, because that's how life is.
Exactly. It's like, I mean, for me also the comedy allows breath, because otherwise the sort of baroqueness starts to suffocate. And so the humor is an invitation to breathe and maybe get a glass of water.
Right. So I want to talk to you about the issue of catharsis.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for somebody who's been through as much as you have been through, it's very easy, I think, to maybe characterize the writing of a book like this as like a cathartic act. And something that you have said, and I'm going to quote you to yourself, is making art, if I may,
Okay.
making art isn't necessarily cathartic. Instead, it can be a protective cocoon.
Yeah.
So, and I think maybe when you said this, you were referring to the writing of Mean.
Yes, I
But
was.
I'm wondering if the same applied to the writing of Creep.
I would say that the writing of Creep was very different than the writing of Mean, and it didn't necessarily function in the same cocoon-like way. But that statement about the writing of Mean is intended to satisfy those people who are curious about like creative experiences and their relationship to catharsis. And I think a misunderstanding that is very popular related to those phenomena, and that misunderstanding is that catharsis is an unavoidable side effect of art making, and I don't think that that's the case. Art making can be really arduous, and art making can itself be traumatizing or re-traumatizing. For example, when I was working on my memoir Mean, and I was writing about the perpetrator Tommy Jesse Martinez, who was a stranger who sexually assaulted me, who assaulted other women, and who actually brutally murdered one of those women, I didn't know many of the details related to Martinez's attacks of others, and I did not know the details involving the murder. And so when I learned about those, that reopened wounds and it created new wounds because I didn't know that. And exposing myself to that information was really difficult and really painful to navigate. And so art making can be the wound in and of itself. And I think that there's this fantasy that especially when a woman engages in some sort of confessional work, that confessional work functions as a purge. But vomiting and art making are not the same thing. It's not as if you empty yourself of experience. Like, you still carry that experience. You still carry that pain, even when you have externalized it. And especially if you've externalized it for the sake of aestheticizing it. Because not all art is therapeutic. Only some art is therapeutic. And ironically, when I was working on Mean, I was surviving domestic violence. And I was living with a person who I feared would take my life for extremely petty reasons. That's how violent this person was.
This is Q. This is Q in the book.
Exactly. So this is the person that I wrote about in the title essay. And you can't have catharsis under those circumstances when you're sleeping with one eye open. You're not like, oh God, I feel so unburdened. Like, no. Like, catharsis is like the furthest thing from your life. And so what I'm inviting people to consider is that unless you know the conditions under which a work of art was created, don't assume that it was freeing.
And then the protective cocoon part of it, I'm imagining, is that you're living with someone who is abusing you, and your place of solace was in this work.
Exactly. Because, you know, when a person experiences domestic violence, which I prefer to refer to as coercive control, because ultimately all of that violence, all of those threats are done for the sake of controlling, right? The abuser is essentially like a puppeteer, and they want to control you completely. That manuscript was one of the few areas of my life that this person could not control. He couldn't follow me into the manuscript, right? Like, he could chase me around where we lived. He could enter into my phone. He was, you know, monitoring my comings and goings, but he didn't live in my imagination. And so my imagination was my cocoon.
Like your reprieve.
Exactly. It was my haven.
You eventually had to escape. It's so harrowing, like unbelievable.
It is, and I also hope that like this essay can kind of shift conversations around women's and victims of all genders who have to escape from coercive controllers and escape from domestic violence, right? So often the conversation is framed in terms of leaving, but I've never heard anybody who asks somebody who was incarcerated in a prison, why didn't you leave? Dude, I'm in a fucking prison. Like, you don't leave a prison. Domestic violence is a prison. You don't walk out of a prison. Right? What do the guards do? The guards will shoot you if you leave. You have one guard and that's your abuser. And you don't get killed for staying. You get killed for leaving. So yeah, I always find it very strange when there's that question, why didn't you leave? Well, I was in a prison, asshole. Like, what'd you expect me to do? Like, leaving and escaping prison is very high stakes. What can happen when you're escaping from prison? You're a fugitive at that point, you know?
So how did you do it? You escaped with help. You didn't just... I
escaped with help. So I planned it. It took me about a month of safety planning with a person who's an advocate who has helped people in this situation before. She had like decades of experience assisting. And so we planned how it would happen. We both decided that the termination of the quote-unquote relationship could not happen face-to-face, because when I had attempted to terminate face-to-face, I was seriously assaulted. I was strangled. And strangulation is terrifying because you literally have somebody holding your ability to breathe in their hands, and they're showing you that they will squeeze the life out of you, right? So, and the other danger indicated by strangulation is that it's a lethality indicator. So those of us who are strangled by abusive partners then have a 750% increased risk of being shot by that partner down the road.
Being shot by them.
Yes, being shot by them. So what some researchers argue is that the strangulation is a warning. Do you want to die? And this is why victims, quote unquote, stay, because we don't want to die. And we've been shown what will happen to us if we dare to leave. We're captives. So I had somebody assist me with that planning. And we went through it very, very meticulously. So I had a very meticulous plan for that day that I would make my exit, that I would flee. And then I also had a safe house arranged. And then there were also individuals who had agreed to protect me. So it was an orchestrated event. It wasn't as if you just say, deuces, I'm leaving. Hell no, I don't want to die. So I planned it very carefully,
Mm. Well, I want to shift, and I want to ask you, I think, a question related to something we spoke about a bit ago. Has to do with this, the associations that you make in this collection, like often unexpected, beautifully done, like these really fun moments for the reader where you're connecting dots. And I'm going to quote you again to yourself because this really struck me. It made me think of that issue, but it also, I think, illuminates the way that you approach the work, and I want to hear you talk about it. You say, quote, "I don't approach writing as straight narrative. I approach writing more like a math problem."
Yeah.
Like, so can you talk just a bit about like what that means, and is it related in the way that I'm imagining to the way that you might play with, for example, associations? It feels like pieces clicking together. It feels like mathematical in a way, or I could imagine how you could imagine it, or it's how I can imagine you conceiving of it.
Yeah. I am a big enthusiast of puzzles. Like, I love puzzles. And to me, essays are puzzles, right? And sometimes I'm missing pieces. And so when I approach an essay, I can become quite obsessed with finding those values, finding those pieces, like I mentioned earlier, sort of solving for Y or solving for X. And so I will place what appear to be sort of these disparate pieces side by side, and then consider how they might function together as an assemblage. How might I put these together? And it's my job to find what those relationships are. And sometimes the relationships are very tenuous. And those tenuous relationships can be interesting to me. And then at other times I find these very tightly knit, tightly woven relationships that I couldn't see, but that I had to do some digging in order to find. And so what's funny is, like, I hated math when I was a kid, when I was growing up. And so I feel like I have finally found sort of a type of pseudo-math through essay writing that I perhaps can finally be proud of, because I did so poorly in math when I was a kid. When I was a kid, if a subject matter did not come easily to me, I loathed it. And math was one of those. Like, math was one of those subjects that I did really well at until I turned about 11 or 12. And then suddenly, like, my math skills vanished. I don't know how or why, but...
Well, I don't think it's that uncommon for writerly people to hit the wall in math at some point.
Yeah.
But this is math in service of what you like to do and what you are made to do, right? I mean, this is math that works for you. Otherwise, it's like, I think we were correct as children to ask the question, like, how the hell am I going to use this in my life? The answer is not at all, most likely. So it was fine to be disinterested. It's not my thing. But I want to ask you about the musicality of your writing, and like there is in it a kind of energy. I always call it like the energy of the spoken word. Like some writing more so than others feels really written, which is, of course your writing is written too, but
Yeah.
there's also writing that I think in its style has the energy of the spoken. There's a real vitality to it, and it feels like, well, this person's just talking to me.
Yeah.
And I know from poking around that you come from a family of storytellers, as writers often do.
Yes.
And not only that, with your family roots in Guadalajara in Mexico, there is an oral tradition in storytelling that is like pronounced, pun intended. And then I know too that you read your work aloud as part of like a self-editorial function, which I do as well. A lot of writers, I think, do this. But can you just talk a little bit about like finding your voice in that way, and the musicality of your work, and the importance of hearing it spoken?
I love the sound of language, and I love the sound of storytelling, and I love when I'm swept up into the rhythms that are composed by masterful storytellers. And I was like informally mentored by masterful storytellers in my family. And tellers of tall tales. For example, my grandfather, who I wrote an essay about in the collection, he was a storyteller and a teller of tall tales, and I loved and continue to love sort of the bigness of his stories. And also,
this is the grandfather who was friends with Juan Rulfo.
Juan Rulfo, yeah, he was a publicist, and so I feel very fortunate to have had a grandparent who was a publicist, because he really demonstrated for me how to inflate a story. How to make it big. And also, publicists are also people who are unafraid of gimmick. He's a very gimmicky person, and so and a person who was unafraid of novelty. So I feel as if I inherited a passion for those phenomena from him. And like you were saying before, I read all of my work to myself, and I do that because I intend for my work to be read to like a live audience. And I never want to be caught in front of that live audience with work that hasn't been read and reread, and whose music isn't as close to perfect and finished as I can get it. And the only way that I can get the work to that point is to expose the work to my own ear and others' ears over and over and over. So it's kind of an arduous process, but it's one that I'm committed to. I think one of the other reasons that I'm also so devoted to like orality is that I taught for a long time, and I worked with teens. I taught high school, and it is very dangerous to have bored teenagers on your hands. So, and so I, again, had to teach myself how to hold young people's attention. And again, gimmick and novelty is very helpful.
You got to be an entertainer if you're going to teach.
Absolutely. And if you fail, you're going to be in trouble.
I was going to say, they will let you know.
Oh, absolutely. And so I credit my students also for refining those skills.
Well, speaking of young people, speaking of teenagers, something that I read about you that charmed me has to do with the way that you learned how to write, and especially like in an autodidactic sense. You taught yourself to write. You've said this again. I quote you to yourself. I taught myself to write through choosing literary ancestors and mimicking them. Mm-hmm. And you're in Catholic school growing up, and you're going to the library, and you're picking books off the shelf. I think you were assigned a lot of American modernists as a student.
Yes, a ton.
you're falling in love with some of those writers, you're reading more of those writers, and then, crucially, I think this is a really important point, you read about their lives. So it wasn't
Yes.
just reading their work, which is vital, but you
Hmm.
then went and found literary biographies, for example, and read about their lives and how they did it. This is a very shrewd act, I think, by a teenage Myriam Gurba to self-educate, because it's an excellent way to learn, and like maybe the most efficient way to learn. If somebody has done something really well that you want to do, read about how they did it and then copy them.
Exactly. It's okay to use training wheels, and sometimes those training wheels uh, are, sort of like embodying the style or the voice of sort of these literary greats that one admires, until we can let go of those training wheels, until we can take those off the vehicle. And so, yeah, I do still encourage people to use that technique, and I came to that technique, like you said, in high school. I had a literature teacher who bombarded us with a lot of modernist works. I fell in love with some of them. And she also had us reading a lot of confessional poets. And it was when I got to the confessional poets that I thought, I might be able to do this too, because I can confess to some bullshit. So
I've got that ability.
exactly. And so I thought to myself, I could do this, but it seems that I also need to deploy some discipline, right? So I became, and this is so cliched, but I became fascinated with Sylvia Plath's work, right? Because one of the assigned works that year, it was my senior year, was The Bell Jar. So I remember reading The Bell Jar, and then I remember accessing all sorts of biographical information about Plath afterwards, because I became fascinated by her as a literary figure, and then wanted to read about her practice, right? Her writing practice. And so I educated myself about that writing practice and then began mimicking it. So I learned that she had a particular writing schedule that she abided by, and I thought to myself, okay, well, if I want to be comparable to Plath, I too must have a rigorous schedule. And so I did that. I placed myself on this schedule, and I needed to produce a certain number of pages every day. And I would come home from school, and I would go to my notebook and sit in the corner of my room, and then give myself prompts, and then prompt myself to produce. And then I remember much later learning that one of the things that Didion had done when she was teaching herself to write was she would take Hemingway's work and sit down at the typewriter and type out his entire novels.
Right.
So that way she would become incredibly intimate with the syntax. And I was like, yeah, it's training wheels. It's okay to use training wheels.
Now, and you're the child of teachers.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems like you came to this approach intuitively, but I have to believe, being the child of teachers maybe gave you a bit of a leg up in terms of like how to self-educate, right? You're surrounded by educators. People are teacherly around you. You yourself are teacherly. Like you have a knack for this. No? Yes?
I think that there's definitely like some influence there. I also think that like the like autodidactic streak that I have, I think that we can also blame that on a year or two of Montessori school. Because as a kid, I had like kindergarten and first grade in Montessori. And from what I recall in Montessori, you're encouraged to learn what you want to learn. And what doesn't interest you, you can kind of turn your back on. And that kind of spoiled me for the rest of my life. Like that's been the sort of that's been the attitude that I've had toward learning, is if I love it, I love it, and I'm going to completely devote myself to it and give myself over to this field of knowledge. And if I don't, fuck it. I don't need it. I can ignore it. And so I think that style of learning really gave me like a tremendous amount of confidence. I would argue that it might have even given me a surplus of confidence, and sometimes maybe I need to dial it back a little bit.
No, but I think that's good in a lot of ways. You know, I think it is like to have that sort of confidence that I can learn things, or that I
Yeah.
should have confidence in what I like. You know what I'm saying? I should have confidence in these feelings I have. And
Yeah.
don't second guess yourself. Go for it. You know, it's better to
Yeah.
jump in, and it's better to jump in, I think, in life in most cases,
Yeah.
and then you figure out where you've went wrong along the way or after the fact a little bit, rather than to timidly be always in a crouch, you know, like wondering.
Yeah.
You're never going to get anything done that way. So,
Definitely.
you know, we've talked about place earlier in this conversation, but I do want to like dial in the focus a little bit more. It would be a shame for us to not discuss Santa Maria a little bit, because this is a California book, but Santa
Yeah.
Maria is the town that you were raised in. And I don't think that it is a town that is on the radar of many people outside of California or even within California. You know,
Absolutely.
it's not the San Francisco, Los Angeles, Berkeley, whatever these bigger, you know, more famous places. You know, but Santa Maria is in North Santa Barbara County.
Yeah.
It is both coastal and agrarian.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you talk a little bit about it so people can get a sense of where you're from?
So Santa Maria is kind of like one of those blink and you miss it kind of towns. You know what I mean? Like if you're on the highway and you're not really paying very close attention to your travels, you might not even realize that you've driven through Santa Maria. It's a short town, not a tall town. And by that I mean it's one of those towns in California that just sprawls. And it seems to kind of sprawl without rhyme or reason. And like you mentioned, it's an agricultural community. Parts of it feel kind of rural or semi-rural, but that is also I don't want to say tempered because that's not the right word, but that agricultural character almost seems to clash with it being not quite a beach town, but as close to the sea as it is. I was born and raised there, and the town is celebrated for its agricultural production. It's a strawberry capital. It's also a barbecue capital. It's known for its tri-tip, which is quite delicious. And the environs are really beautiful, but it's the sort of place where, like, when you're a teenager, you can't really sort of, well, at least when I was a teenager, it was difficult for me to appreciate the beauty that I was surrounded by. You know, you're itching to leave, you're itching to escape, you just want to do drugs. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
And as a young person, it feels very boring and very sleepy. And Santa Maria has very few claims to fame. And one of the few, and this is one that, you know, locals don't necessarily like to trumpet, but it was where Michael Jackson was tried. It's the home of the Michael Jackson trial.
Oh, wow. Say no more.
Exactly. And like Michael Jackson was this weird fixture in like a lot of Santa Maria locals' childhoods, because he lived, or he would frequently be at Neverland Ranch, which was not in Santa Maria proper, but it was about a 30-minute drive away. And so you know, there was no shopping around the ranch. The ranch was rural. So Jackson would come into Santa Maria to do his shopping and his socializing sometimes. So we have one mall in town, and that mall was a place where you could have a Michael Jackson sighting. And it was always incredibly surreal. You know, it's like you're at the pretzel shop and there's Michael Jackson. You know what I mean? It's like,
Did you see him growing up?
did I ever see Michael Jackson? I did not see Michael Jackson growing up, but like everybody, like I have 1 degree of separation from him. You know what I mean? Because
Sure.
everybody has their stories. Like I knew a man, for example, who was one of the groundskeepers, who had stories.
I bet.
Yeah, that I'm not supposed to repeat. But
Oh, come on, please, let's break some news.
um, but yeah, so many of us had those stories. I mentioned the pretzels because I did have a friend who worked at the pretzel shop who was one day standing outside the pretzel shop dispensing like free samples, like they do at the mall.
Yeah, little like pretzel nuggets or
And
whatever.
yeah, exactly. And Michael Jackson came clacking by wearing his surgical mask, and my friend was just overwhelmed. Like he didn't know what to do other than offer Michael Jackson a pretzel bite.
Did he
So,
take it? Did Michael Jackson eat carbs? Is the question.
he declined.
He declined. I
He
bet he did.
declined. He did not want the pretzel. Yeah,
If he's wearing a surgical mask pre-COVID in a mall, then he's probably not
exactly.
taking the public
Right?
pretzel bits or whatever, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I remember my dad complaining when the trial was happening because my dad worked about 2 blocks away. My dad's office was about 2 blocks away from the courthouse where Jackson was tried, and it became such a three-ring circus. Like there were paparazzis on the roofs, like all up and down the streets, and then there was rarely traffic in Santa Maria, like traffic jams, but during the trial there was actual traffic, and my father was so angry that Michael Jackson's misdeeds had brought traffic to Santa Maria.
It's blasphemy. God
Right?
forbid.
I remember him saying, "I hate it. I can't stand it." I remember one day he was complaining that there was a giant panda. There was somebody wearing a panda suit on roller skates, and they were dispensing coupons to Panda Express, and my dad had all this rage about the panda because the panda was holding up traffic. Like it was,
It's a circus.
Exactly.
We got a roller skating panda in town, for God's sake.
Exactly. So, that's a snapshot of Santa Maria for you.
Well, listen, I gotta say,
The Chamber of Commerce is going to be inviting me to
you're the favorite daughter. You're the favorite daughter of Santa Maria at this point.
give me the key to the city, but
Yeah. Hey, I gotta say, reading this book, I kept thinking to myself, like, wow, Myriam is such an interesting person. You've had an interesting life. This is also a credit to you as a writer. I think
Thank you.
we find ways to like really dig in and find what's interesting about our life and our ancestry and our cultural context, like all these ways. But you really bring it to the fore. To me, Santa Maria is now like mythology. Next time I'm on the 101, I'm stopping. I'm going to go look for a roller skating panda bear. I'm going to go check out the courthouse. But this is what good writers do.
And some tri-tip.
Yes. Well, I'm vegetarian, so I will.
Buy some fresh strawberries from the stand on the side of the road.
I will.
Okay.
Those are always the best berries anyway,
Exactly.
So I want to talk to you next about this time period in between the first time we met and spoke in my old dirty garage that was, had hornets in it, as I think we discussed before we started recording.
Yeah.
And now, as you're celebrating the publication of Creep, a lot has happened
Yeah.
in your life in that time period. Like I was thinking that to myself as I was reading, like working my way through the collection. I was like, wow, this has been a busy few years for Myriam Gurba. And I think in particular, I want to talk about one of the essays in Creep, which has to do with an essay, or it has to do with a book by another author. And it's the whole American Dirt. What do you call it? Saga? I don't know if that's the right word, but
We can call it a media moment.
A media moment. Yeah, there was a media moment with that. You write about it in this new collection. And it has to do with, I think, issues of cultural appropriation. It has to do with a book that was like widely celebrated by the publishing industry. Like a lot of like name authors blurbed it. It sold for 7 figures, I want to say.
Yes, it was a 7-figure deal, yeah.
And then, you read it because it has to do with the border and it features Mexican characters. And you were like, what? Like, you just talk a little bit about your response to reading the book and maybe like coming to be aware of it, because there aren't that many books in any given publishing year
Yeah.
that sell for seven figures, especially literary fiction. So I mean, this
Yeah.
this got on your radar somehow, and I can imagine maybe at first you're like, ooh, kind of like maybe with some anticipation and excitement, and then you read it and did not have an excited feeling.
So I didn't have anticipation or excitement. I kind of had some confusion about the book when it was first assigned to me by a feminist magazine. I had reviewed one title for them prior to this assignment, and that title was Sheri Moraga's memoir. And so when they sent this thriller to me, I didn't know it was a thriller. I knew nothing about it beyond just its title, American Dirt. And
Wait, I'm sorry to interrupt, but like, did I mischaracterize it as literary fiction? I have not read American Dirt, so like, it's a
it's
thriller.
An thriller. It's not.
Okay.
It was marketed as literary fiction. So you're correct in stating that it was marketed that way, but I don't really think it satisfies what some folks might, categorize as literary fiction. So the book got assigned to me, and given the title, I was like, is this a book about agronomy? Like, what? You know what I mean? Like, it's such a weird title. So I took the book with me to Mexico, ironically. And I was in my aunt's house when I was reading it, and I was like, what the fuck is this? This is what? Oh my God, this is embarrassing. So I wrote the review,
And what was embarrassing about it, just for people who haven't read?
Well, I mean, the book was embarrassing to me because of the way that it was being marketed, right? The book was being marketed as social realism akin to Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Then I read it, and it's a tawdry narco thriller. Grapes of Wrath is not a tawdry narco thriller. And that's why, like, part of the title I partially titled the essay about the experience of reviewing the book, You Ain't Steinbeck, because there's nothing Steinbeckian about that work, right? Or about that author's list. Like, none of her works are like that.
The author in question is Jeanette Cummins, or Janine Cummins, yeah.
And so what I felt was that the way that the book was being marketed was extremely disingenuous. And so what I wanted to do was correct that disingenuousness by stating that, like, yes, it seems as if this woman has appropriated these very sort of cliched soap operatic tropes and narratives surrounding the drug trade in Mexico. And there's no sort of social analysis. There's none. This is a story about a mother saving her son and herself from assassins. And so she's on this quest to the great United States where she's going to be safe. And, I just found it really galling that that the United States was positioned as a hero of sorts, where women who are facing gender-based violence go for protection when, women get murdered in the United States too, and we get murdered due to misogyny as well. Like, misogyny exists on both sides of the so-called border. So that bugged me. It annoyed me. And it just seemed so funny to me that so many of the people who were praising the book were praising it for, like, some presumed authenticity, and I'm not even sure what authenticity is. But I think that, like, what these readers are, with these folks who are praising the book were communicating was that the book felt Mexican to them, right? It gave them Mexican feels. And then, right? Like,
well, and we should say, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Janine Cummins is not of Mexican descent.
Yeah,
correct?
she's not of Mexican descent, but like you don't have to be of Mexican descent to write well about Mexico. Like you don't have to be from a place to write well about it. But if you study a place well and you study people well, then you can write very competently about them. And so I got the sense that she was a person who had not done her homework. And for example, like one of the instances that I cite in my critique is that like the main character in the thriller is when she's journeying northward to find refuge in the United States, she is absolutely shocked to discover an ice skating rink in Mexico. And I learned how to ice skate in Mexico. like we've got some technology in Mexico. Like we have ice. Like you know what I mean? I was just like, what the fuck? Like, oh my God. Like, why is this Mexican acting like an American tourist? Oh, it might be because the person who authored this character is representing Mexico according to her perceptions of it. Like to me, it seemed that that's what was happening. And so for a reader like me, that representation is laughable. It comes off almost like a joke. You know what I mean?
And so,
but it's also kind of offensive. It's like, ugh, like really? It's 2023 and we're doing this, but also, or 2022 or whatever year it was. No, it was 2020. So it's 2020 and we're doing this. And then the other thing that I just found like so gross was that like we were living through the Trump administration at the time, and Trump was considering invading Mexico. And then this is going to be the Mexican book that we're all supposed to turn to learn about the immigration crisis. Is this turd? You know what I mean? So,
right.
so that's sort of a sampling of the critiques that I had of the book.
Yeah, it's really nuanced.
Yeah, so like appropriation wasn't really at the core of my critique, even though I do mention appropriation because I think that people can appropriate really effectively. But this lady wasn't one of them, you know?
And so you wanted to, I mean, clearly it caused you to write this review, and it's a pretty scathing review or a really pointed critique. And when you tried to publish it,
one more thing.
Yeah.
I did recommend the book. I gave the book a recommendation. I said that it would be a great addition to your stuck-up gringa book club. Like if there's a certain kind of reader that's going to eat this up, and I said that in the review.
Well, and we should say that this book went on to sell millions of copies around the world. It's a very popular book.
And it's so weird that like there are people who say that Myriam Gurba is the reason why this book became a bestseller. And then there's another group of people that says Myriam Gurba is the reason that the book got canceled. Which is it, bitches? That's a contradictory statement. Which did I do? You guys are ascribing me too much power. I think that the reason it became a bestseller is because Oprah touched it. You know? It doesn't really have much to do with me.
Oh, if Oprah touches a book, it's going to be a bestseller. That's a guarantee.
Thank you. She's got the Midas touch. I don't have the Midas touch.
So you write this review.
I'm a writer.
But you write this review, and you submit it to, I believe, Miss Magazine, the feminist magazine you alluded to earlier. And what was the person said something to you like, you're not famous enough to write a review this pointed or something. Isn't that right?
So there were several editors who I communicated with, and it was kind of a game of telephone, because I get the sense that there was like a hierarchy, and that the messages were being transmitted down the hierarchy to me. And ultimately, like, I was told, like, wow, this is really harsh. And I interpreted like one of the messages that I got to mean like, you know, you're not well known enough to write a review that is this scathing. Then later on, I got a follow-up message or email from the editors that said, no, that's not what we meant. What we meant was Janine Cummins is not famous enough to receive a review this scathing. And I was like, how is that any better than the first thing that you said? Like, both of these reasons for not publishing the review are bullshit. Like, I think that this person wrote a shitty book and you asked me to review it. And now you're telling me that I can't say that it's as shitty as it is because she's not famous? What? That doesn't make any sense. So yeah, so they refused to publish it, although they said that they would conditionally publish it. And the condition was if I could find something, if I could praise it, if I could figure out how to praise it. And I was just like, I don't have any praise for it. I think it's a turd. Like, I think it's a turkey. I don't want to have to praise it. And I've never, ever, like, you know, I've reviewed books before. This was not my first book that I've reviewed. I've never had an editor tell me, if you can say something nice about it, we'll publish your review. Like, I've never had anybody say that to me before.
Why do you think they wanted that? What was the motivation?
I don't know. I don't know why they wanted me to do that. I feel like maybe people understood the way that this book was being positioned. And so everybody kind of had to get in line to elevate the book. And
that's what I'm thinking, is like, maybe there's an editor at Miss Magazine who's like, we don't want to alienate Oprah for some reason.
I mean, maybe they didn't want to piss somebody off, and they figured that I would, you know, that this would piss off somebody powerful. And so they refused to, so they killed the review, and that made me really angry. And so then I wrote an essay about the entire experience, and then I nestled the rejected review or the killed review inside of the essay. And the essay itself wasn't so much like a critique of that book. It was more a criticism of the publishing industry and the way that white supremacy works within the industry. And that's what the essay was about.
And so the essay goes out in, I'm going to forget the name of the publication that put it up.
Tropics of Meta.
Yeah.
It's an academic site.
So they published the review. Untouched. They published your review as you wanted it to be. They
published the essay with the review couched inside of it.
Got it.
And then that essay went viral.
Okay, that's the point, is that this thing, you know, Miss Magazine says, no, not unless you can say something nice and sweet, and you say, no thanks, and you take it to Tropics of Meta. Tropics of Meta?
Yes.
And then it goes up, and it becomes this viral thing.
Yeah, it was very weird. I was surprised by the virality.
Yeah. And then it leads to the formation of something called Dignidad Literaria.
Yes.
That you form in conjunction with authors David Bowles and Robert Lovato.
Yeah.
Which is about...
So Dignidad Literaria was, or I should say is, although it's you know, hibernating now, a social movement that fights white supremacy in publishing. And as a social movement, we invited all sorts of folks to participate in various town halls in order to discuss the state of publishing, racism in publishing. We also invited people to participate in art happenings, and we also met with executives and staff at Flatiron to discuss
Flatiron being
the publishers of American Dirt. We met with them to discuss what they might do in order to transform the situation or remedy the situation.
How were those meetings?
They were weird. Like, I mean, it was like there were a lot of like phone meetings, but there was like one meeting in person where I was scolded by one of the executives for having a mean tone, which I just found really odd. I was like, what? Like, why are you scolding me about my tone? And so he, you know, he was sort of telling me that I needed to be nice to his friend, Janine. Janine's a really good person, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm being critical of this lady, but like, criticism is fair game, right? Like, that's part of this industry. why are you telling me that like I need to tiptoe or walk on eggshells around this particular writer? Like, this is some bullshit. So so I remember one of my comrades mentioned when I was being chastised that like I had been the recipient of some threats, and shortly after Tropics of Meta published the essay, I got like a death threat, and it was like a weird, ugly one, right? About basically like the police executing me. I mean, that's unpleasant to read about law enforcement killing you, you know?
It's not.
So,
It's not a great way. It's not a great thing to wake up to. I will concede.
no, it's super shitty. You know what I mean? And it's like I already have PTSD from having been through like sexual violence and gender-based violence. So when people continue to threaten more violence, it can be triggering, like legitimately triggering. And so like, you know, one of my comrades brought that up, and then the executive who had been like chastising me was like, oh yeah, well Janine's gotten similar threats too. And then there was a staff member at the table who chimed in, and you know what she said? She goes, no, she didn't. Janine didn't get any death threats. There was no threats of violence against her. And Flatiron had released a statement saying that they had to cancel Cummins' tour because of all of these threats of violence. And I was just like, I had suspected that like maybe the threats that they had stated were overblown. But now I have this person stating, no, she just didn't get any threats, period. And then I thought to myself, oh my God, she even appropriated my death threats. She even, like that's the extent to which these people will appropriate. They'll even take other people's death threats and like pump them up, you know what I mean? And make them their own. So it was weird. It was weird.
Did anything positive or productive come from it?
Yes, there was an additional editor brought on, and there have been more titles acquired that are manuscripts by Latina folks. So there was some good that came of it. Although, like, the systemic change that I would want to see is not happening. But, I mean, that systemic change is going to require, like, a major revolution. So I'm still waiting for that.
Yeah. Well, you've had quite a few years, like, in life and in writing. I don't think we didn't get to everything, but you write about a lot of it. And I'll leave it to listeners to like dig in, read the book, and explore. I know that we're talking like kind of on the eve of publication of Creep, which is always like an exciting time for a writer, a little bit uneasy. You know, there's all these years and all this living, especially in a work of creative nonfiction, has gone into the creation of this book. Like, how are you handling it, and how are you feeling?
I'm a little bit nervous.
Early reviews are good.
Oh God, I'm a really superstitious person. So like, I don't like to talk about reviews.
Okay.
Because I feel like I'll jinx myself. You know what I mean?
I totally know what you mean. I'm knocking on wood right now, like on your behalf.
Thank you. I was about to do that too. I'm going to do it right now.
There we go.
Yeah.
But I will say, even if you're not aware, you know, like there's positive energy, I feel like, in the reception. And I think a lot of people, especially people who read and enjoyed Mean, have been waiting for this one. Is that there a sense that you have that have you been hearing from readers?
I hope so. I mean, I am not a writer who writes for everyone. I know there are some writers who say, I write for everyone, or I write for myself. I don't write for myself or for everyone. I write for like very specific audiences, and I do have like a soft spot for survivors of sexual violence, and in particular of gender-based violence. And so the book is for that community of people, among other communities. That's one of the communities that I always I always consider as a potential audience, and as an audience that I have a lot of affection for.
Well, I am not a survivor, and I totally resonated with this book. It's good, like I say, you've lived a really interesting life, and you're great at sort of, I don't know if mythologizing is the right word, but like drawing these associations and just like spinning a yarn, like spinning it into literature. And I was totally on board with it. And I always ask my guests if they have anything else in the works. It's fine if you don't, if you're just kind of like taking a breath after writing this one. But I got to say, Myriam, I am envisioning a bookshelf containing like your collected works, and I'm seeing lots of one-word titles. It's like mean, creep. Like, what's the next one?
So for my next book, I want to critique true crime as a genre. That's what I want to do next, because some of the work that I've done in some ways can be categorized as true crime, but it's also in tension with true crime. And I used to have a voracious appetite for true crime. And that was the case prior to my acknowledgement that I have post-traumatic stress disorder. And once I began to work very diligently toward some healing, that appetite vanished. And so what I'm interested in doing is exploring women's consumption of true crime, because it primarily has a female audience. So I want to look at the reasons for that attraction and that appeal. And my theory is that if we were to live in a culture that was committed to the prevention of gender-based violence and the support of victims, this broad and very like robust interest in true crime, like the market would sort of wither, I think, because I think that it's stepping in to sort of fill that vacuum.
That's interesting. So as soon as you started to take on the project of really investing in your healing, that is when your interest dissipated.
Have to mourn what had happened to me vicariously through other women's victimization.
That's that's interesting. That's an astute psychological take. Because I got to say, like personally, I guess I will sometimes read true crime or books that are like tangentially associated with true crime, but I don't have time. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, with regard to the Richard Ramirez documentary, I can't watch scary shit before bed. So like, I know there's a million documentaries about true crime, and I'm just like, no thanks. Like, I need to sleep. That stuff creeps me out. To use your word, I don't need to ingest that before going to sleep. And I'm sort of like a little bit confused and in awe of people who are like, yeah, I love to just read about these horrible things that have happened to people. But
I was talking to a friend the other day who was talking to me, or I was talking to a friend the other day who was mentioning CrimeCon, which is a big, true crime convention. And she was saying that one of the most disturbing stalls or booths that she saw there was a massage area where you listen to your favorite sort of true crime anecdotes or stories while you receive a massage. Like, how repulsive is that? How grotesque is that? Like, how do you relax through that? So it's like things like that I want to scrutinize,
Yeah. Well, and I think this idea of it being an act of mourning, that's interesting.
Exactly.
And I think there's a lot of truth in it. That makes like immediate sense to me. So
I think a lot of it is unresolved grief.
Yeah. Well, I'll be excited to read that one. And it's been a delight to talk with you. Congratulations on all the success that you've had. Congratulations on surviving all that you have had to survive.
Thank you.
And I wish you well with this book as it rolls out and with, the one that comes next.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.